It's late. The lights are low, and you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're drifting through ancient festivals, where flowers were weapons, masks whispered secrets, and drinking the wrong way could cost your life. We'll begin with the bloom and blood of ritual battles, then slip into the shadows with ghost stories and forbidden rites, and we'll end where the moon watches, with punishment, silence, and sobriety. In the spring, when the sun lingered longer and flowers exploded across the hillsides, the city of Tenochtitlan transformed. Streets were swept clean, temples repainted, and markets filled with offerings for gods and guests alike. The air smelled of burning copal and blooming maguey. It was the season of rebirth, not just for crops and flowers, but for people too. The Aztecs didn't separate nature from religion. One was proof of the other. When flowers returned to the earth, the gods were said to smile again. This was when the Vaintina festivals began, the great 20-day celebrations that marked each part of the ritual calendar. Some honored rain gods or the sun, others called on spirits of corn or death. But in springtime, it was the festival of war and beauty that took center stage. Known to the Spanish chroniclers as a time of flower battles, these weren't just bloody contests. They were sacred performances. To fight in this context wasn't to conquer. It was to offer your breath, your sweat. Young warriors from noble schools were prepared for months in advance. They learned not just combat, but choreography. When to strike, when to fall, when to look fierce and when to look humble. The point wasn't to win, it was to impress the gods, to be seen, to be remembered. Warriors painted their faces with soot and chalk. They wore tunics dyed with crushed insects and feathers. Even their sandals were painted. Their appearance mattered. In the eyes of the gods, form was just as holy as function. The battles took place outside the cities, often in clearings chosen for their symmetry. Flower garlands marked the perimeter. At the center stood a shrine or banner representing the deity being honored. Warriors saluted it before engaging. They didn't fight to the death, but to the capture, a way of creating prisoners who could later serve ritual purposes. The audience watched from mounds or temple stairs, not as spectators, but as spiritual witnesses. Every move was seen, every drop of sweat recorded. Among the weapons were wooden swords with obsidian blades, round shields painted with family symbols, and atlatls, spear throwers, that hurled darts with surprising speed. But even here, aesthetics mattered. Weapons were often decorated, carved, or dyed. Even violence had to be beautiful. The gods, after all, had taste. Pulque, the sacred fermented drink made from maguey sap, flowed before and after these battles. It wasn't a drink of celebration, but of sanctification. Warriors sipped it from ceramic bowls painted with sky and fire motifs. Drinking before battle was forbidden, but afterward, especially after a capture, a single serving was allowed. It was a communion with the gods, a reminder that all victory was theirs, not man's. Too much and it became a sin, but just enough and it was holy. Children reenacted these rituals at home. In courtyards and dusty alleys, they tied rags to sticks and shouted made-up chants, copying the warriors they saw. Parents watched quietly, not discouraging them. This was education. This was memory in motion. The cycle of honoring life through staged conflict was being passed on, one flower petal footstep at a time. This wasn't just culture. It was worldview. The flower battles reflected a deep belief that life, like spring, was brief and blooming. You didn't escape death by avoiding it. You faced it, adorned it, and made it part of your devotion. To fight was not to destroy, it was to offer. And in offering, you became part of the eternal return. The same way the flowers came back, again and again, even after the hardest winter. And so, as each spring returned and the festivals unfolded again, the people found comfort in the repetition. They knew that their gods demanded order, not just through laws and labor, but through rhythm and ceremony. These flower battles weren't remembered for who won or lost, but for how beautifully they were carried out. In the Aztec world, beauty was sacred, and to live beautifully, even in struggle, was the highest form of praise. Pulque was not simply a drink. For the Aztecs, it was a sacred substance, a gift from the gods, wrapped in contradiction. Could heal and destroy, inspire visions or incite shame. Made from the fermented sap of the maguey plant, pulque was thick, white, and slightly sour. It was consumed in ceremonies, festivals, and even funerals, but it was never just for pleasure. Drinking pulque was a ritual act, one that revealed who you were when the gods looked straight through you. Only certain people were allowed to drink pulque freely. Priests, warriors, and elders had ceremonial access. But for the common folk, its use was tightly restricted. There were laws, and they were severe. A young man who drank pulque without permission could be beaten, publicly humiliated, or worse. For elders, it was tolerated. For nobles, it depended on the context. But for everyone, there was a line, and crossing it meant stepping out of the sacred order the gods had ordained. The gods associated with pulque were many, and their stories strange. One of the central figures was a deity sometimes referred to as the 400 rabbits. This wasn't a single god, but a group, each rabbit representing a different form of drunkenness. Some laughed too loudly, some wept, some fell asleep in corners, some danced without shame. The point was clear. Intoxication revealed a person's nature. Pulque didn't make you someone else. It showed what was already inside. Another god, Tezcatlipoca, embodied the duality of drink. He was both divine and dangerous, a patron of those who drank with dignity, and a punisher of those who did not. It was said he could bless a man with insight or curse him with disgrace. To drink pulque was to enter his domain, and to do so without respect was to invite his wrath. That's why pulque was always offered first to the gods before it touched mortal lips. Drinking was a staged performance. The ceramic jars were painted with symbols: the sun, fire, jaguars, bones, and placed in front of altars. Priests would pour the liquid into small bowls or gourd cups, often accompanied by incense and prayers. The act of lifting the cup was slow, deliberate. It was a gesture not of thirst, but of communion. Pulque connected the earth to the sky, the living to the divine. To drink without ritual was to desecrate something holy. Even the texture of pulque had meaning. It was thick like blood or milk, life-giving substances. Its color, pale and cloudy, echoed the mists that shrouded the mountains where gods were said to dwell. People believed it carried memory, not just of the plant, but of the rain, the soil, and the labor that made it. To consume pulque was to take in the world itself in liquid form. Yet the dangers were real. Pulque abuse wasn't just a personal failing, it was a societal threat. Drunkenness could lead to disorder, and disorder offended the gods. Public drunkenness was punished harshly. Offenders could be paraded through the streets, stripped of their garments, or even executed if the offense was repeated. In extreme cases, the punishment was symbolic. The drunk was forced to drink more until they collapsed, a living example of excess turned to ruin. Children were taught these lessons early. They watched their elders drink in silence and learned the weight of each sip. There were stories told around the fire of men who drank too deeply and lost their standing, their families, even their lives. These were not warnings meant to shame, but to guide. Pulque was powerful, and power required humility. If the gods gave you something strong, you were expected to hold it gently. In Aztec murals and codices, scenes of drinking were often juxtaposed with scenes of sacrifice. The message was clear. Both were sacred acts, and both demanded intention. To drink was not escape. It was participation in the cycle of offering and return, of joy and restraint. Pulque wasn't just consumed. It was interpreted like a dream or a poem, and how you drank it revealed how you lived. As the final days of the spring festivals approached, the energy in Tenochtitlan shifted. What had begun as color and music now deepened into something heavier, a sacred fatigue, as if the city itself was catching its breath. The gods had been fed through song, dance, blood, and pulque. Now came the reckoning. It was time to measure how well the people had honored the balance. Had the rituals been beautiful enough? Had the offerings been sincere? These questions weren't asked aloud, but they hung in the air like smoke. One of the final rites involved a procession of costumed children. Dressed as miniature gods, they were led through the streets by elders. Each child had a role: a tiny storm god, a sun bearer, a moon goddess. They held feathers, seeds, or burning incense. This was not play. It was education, a way of teaching the youngest members of society that the divine was always watching, and that their place in the world was not just to grow, but to remember, to become part of the great cycle of thanks and return. These children were followed by dancers with painted faces and cloaks made of paper. The cloaks were fragile, symbolic of human life. With each turn of their bodies, the paper tore and fluttered, showing how quickly beauty could vanish. Musicians walked behind them, playing flutes carved from bone. The sounds were soft and eerie, unlike the loud drums of earlier days. This was a quieter moment, a kind of spiritual exhale, a reminder that even celebration must end in reflection. Elders gathered at the central plaza and burned bundles of herbs wrapped in cloth. They prayed for rainfall and good crops, for peace between neighboring cities, for health and humility. Pulque was offered in small bowls to the gods once more, not as a celebration but as a closing ritual. The bowls were placed beside miniature figurines of deities made of dough and flowers. Some of these were eaten, others were buried. It was a symbolic return of the offerings to the earth. One important aspect of the closing days was the role of silence. After weeks of song and ceremony, families would spend a day in near quiet. Loud speech was avoided. Markets operated at half their size. Even children played more softly. It was a communal gesture of humility, an acknowledgement that no matter how grand the rituals had been, they were never enough on their own. Gratitude had to be paired with modesty. That's what pleased the gods most. And then, just like that, the festival was over. People swept the streets. Dancers washed off their paint. The altars were cleared, but the memory lingered. For the Aztecs, time was not linear, it moved in circles. Every festival was a rehearsal for eternity. The flower battles were not just performances of war and worship. They were rehearsals for how to live and die with grace. As the final garlands wilted and the pulque bowls emptied, the people of Tenochtitlan turned once again toward the sun, ready for whatever the next cycle would bring. Later that evening, Families would gather around their hearths and share stories of the festival's origins. Elders spoke of a time when the first flower battle was held not to conquer, but to prove devotion to the gods. It was said that the earth had grown tired, that the seasons were out of balance, and only a beautiful war, one waged with honor, courage, and ceremony, could restore harmony. These stories reminded everyone, especially the young, that what they had witnessed was not just a spectacle, but a living tradition. In some households, the leftover flower petals were scattered across home altars, mingled with ash and dried maize. It was a gentle act, one that linked the public rituals to private gratitude. Even as the city fell asleep, the gods were believed to remain close. Watching, listening, the people didn't need to shout their thanks anymore. They had danced it, sung it, offered it in silence and color. Now, they let the silence carry the rest of the prayer into the night sky. In the days following the great ceremonies, Tenochtitlan settled into a rhythm of remembrance. The flower battles had ended, and the city's streets no longer echoed with war cries or ceremonial drums. But the scent of marigolds still lingered in the air, and traces of colored chalk clung to the temple steps. The gods had been honored. The people had danced, sung, wept, and spilled blood in the name of balance. And now came the quieter rites, the ones not everyone noticed, but everyone lived. Around household altars, families swept their thresholds and burned leftover flower petals in small clay bowls. These altars, though simple, reflected the grander altars of the temples. A bundle of corn, a shard of obsidian, a smear of red dye, each item carried its own meaning. Even a bit of pulque, left in a tiny bowl overnight, symbolized the closing of the cycle. It was the last sip offered to the gods, who now returned to their distant sky. Throughout the markets, vendors sold festival remnants. Broken flutes, feathered headdresses missing a few plumes, ceramic cups still stained with ritual drink. These were not cast-offs. They were relics of devotion. People bought them not to reuse, but to keep, to place near their homes as quiet tokens of what had passed. Memory was sacred. To remember properly was to participate in the cosmic order. Children returned to their chores and apprenticeships, but their eyes still sparkled with the memory of painted warriors and masked dancers. For weeks afterward, they mimicked festival roles with sticks and straw, shouting prayers and declarations in miniature. Parents watched, amused and respectful. This was how tradition endured, not just through priests and warriors, but through games, gestures, and imitation. Pulque remained in the picture, but only symbolically. After the festivals, drinking was largely forbidden again. The divine permission had passed. Now sobriety returned, not as punishment, but as virtue. To refrain was to show respect. To stay clear-headed was to maintain harmony. In fact, the sudden absence of pulque was itself part of the cycle, a reminder that pleasure, even sacred pleasure, must yield to discipline. Among the priesthood, this post-festival period was one of deep meditation. They fasted, performed cleansing rituals, and recorded visions they had received during the height of celebration. Some believed that during the flower battles, the veil between worlds thinned. Spirits of ancestors and gods alike walked more freely. Now, as that veil thickened again, it was the priest's role to interpret what had been revealed through dreams, omens, and the behavior of the people. Offerings were still made in these quiet days, but they were modest. A handful of seeds, a whispered prayer, a painted rock left beside a tree. The gods did not demand endless noise. They valued rhythm, the pulse of devotion that never fully stopped, even when the drums did. It was a philosophy woven into the fabric of Aztec timekeeping. Everything moved in cycles. Even rest was sacred because it prepared the way for the next beginning. And so, as the city returned to its daily life, fishing, farming, trading, teaching, it did so with a kind of sacred residue. The festivals were not events that ended. They were echoes that lingered in the body and the soil. The warriors who had fought in mock battles now returned to their military duties. The dancers shed their masks but retained the posture. The singers went back to work, still humming the melodies of praise as they ground maize or shaped clay. The final echo of the flower battles came not from temples or plazas, but from within. In the minds of the people, the gods were still listening, still watching. To walk straight, to speak kindly, to offer help to a neighbor. All these became small acts of continued devotion. The flower battles were never really over. They just changed shape. They became part of the breath of the city, folded into the rhythm of ordinary days, until the season returned once more. Though the flower battles and spring festivals had officially ended, their influence echoed for weeks in the daily rhythms of Tenochtitlan. People didn't just return to work. They carried the memory of ritual into everything they did. Cleaning the house became an act of gratitude. Cooking was approached with care, as if the gods might be tasting alongside them. Even drawing water from the canals was done in silence at times, a moment to reflect rather than speak. Schools resumed, but not without reminders of the divine. Boys studying to become priests or warriors reviewed the rituals they had just performed. They copied chants onto bark paper scrolls and practiced the dance steps that once summoned gods. Girls helping in the home mimicked the priestesses they'd seen offering flowers, arranging marigold petals into careful patterns on clay tiles. These weren't just chores or games. They were acts of cultural preservation, ways to ensure that the gods would never be forgotten. In the noble households, storytellers visited to recount the events of the festival. Some emphasized the bravery of mock battles, others the poetic gestures of drunken dancers offering pulque to the heavens. The best stories weren't necessarily the most exciting, but the ones that held a lesson. A tale of a man who drank too deeply and failed to complete a ritual, or a young warrior who held back in the dance and later suffered a string of misfortunes. Stories were tools. They helped people remember what was sacred and what was dangerous. The priests, meanwhile, took time to study the signs left behind. They interpreted the way ashes had scattered, the behavior of the sacrificial fire, even the dreams they'd recorded during the high days of ceremony. They believed the gods left messages in every detail, and it was their duty to read them. If a flame had flickered the wrong way, or a bowl of pulque had spilled too quickly, it could mean drought, unrest, or divine disappointment. These interpretations were then passed quietly to the emperor's court. Within the palace, the emperor consulted his advisors about what had been revealed during the rituals. Would the rains come on time? Had the sun gods accepted the offerings? Were neighboring cities likely to honor the balance or challenge it? These questions were not just spiritual, they were political. The gods, after all, were guardians of both crops and power. If the rituals were misaligned, it could threaten the empire's future. Back among the people, conversations returned often to the symbolism of drunkenness. Pulque had been central to the celebrations, offered to the gods, consumed in ceremony, but now it was almost taboo again. Drinking outside of ritual time was frowned upon. It showed a lack of discipline, a failure to respect the cosmic rhythm. People told cautionary tales about those who had taken one sip too many during the festivals and ended up sick, confused, or humiliated. Pulque was a sacred drink, but also a test. How a person handled intoxication revealed their heart. This belief shaped how children were taught about alcohol. Parents didn't just forbid it, they explained it. They said pulque could bring a man closer to the gods or closer to disgrace, depending on his soul. Some homes kept a small bowl of it on a home altar as a symbol, not for drinking. It was a reminder that even sacred things could become dangerous when taken lightly. And so, the days moved forward, filled with quiet echoes of ritual. The great sounds had faded, but the meaning remained. Every petal swept away, every bowl cleaned and stored, every story told under the fading warmth of spring. It all stitched the memory of the festival deeper into the people's lives. The flower battles weren't just over. They were now part of everyone who had seen them. The gods had been honored, the people had remembered, and the cycle of gratitude, reverence, and restraint would hold steady until the season returned once more. In the final days of the spring festival season, a stillness settled over the city. The plazas were swept clean. The banners were taken down. But something invisible remained, a hush, like the air after a storm. People moved a little slower. Conversations were softer. It was as if everyone, from the farmers to the nobles, was listening for the last echo of the gods' footsteps. This was the time for reflection. Priests offered their final prayers, not with trumpets or flames, but in silence before dawn. A single candle might be lit in a temple, flickering against the stone, its smoke curling toward the heavens. Even the emperor withdrew from public view. His advisors said he spent these days fasting and meditating, reviewing not just the rituals but his own heart. For if the emperor strayed, the entire balance of the world could tip. Among the common people, elders took this time to speak to the young. They told stories that had waited for the right moment, not tales of war or glory, but of mistakes. One elder spoke of a festival long ago when a dancer had tripped during a sacred procession. Some laughed, but the gods had not. The next season brought poor harvests. Another told of a warrior who had accepted praise too proudly and was struck ill before the next offering. These stories were not about fear. They were lessons in humility. Pulque once again became a distant thing, revered but avoided. The jars used for ceremonial drinking were cleaned and stored high on shelves, wrapped in cloth to protect their spiritual weight. In some homes, a small amount was poured into the ground as a farewell, an acknowledgement that joy must be balanced with restraint. Children were taught to look at the drink not with longing, but with reverence. It wasn't a treat, it was a test. Meanwhile, artists and scribes recorded the events of the season. On bark paper and in murals, they painted scenes of flower battles, ceremonial dances, and solemn offerings. These were not just decorative, they were sacred memory. To forget the details, the shape of a mask, the curve of a blade, the order of the chants, was to risk angering the gods in future festivals. Some families commissioned small clay figurines depicting the rituals, placing them on shelves to remind future generations of what had. The cycle of the seasons was everything to the people. They did not believe in linear time, but in circles, always returning, always building upon what came before. And so, as the final embers of the festival burned out, preparations quietly began for the next. Not with noise, but with awareness. People cleaned their tools with more care. Farmers walked their fields more thoughtfully. Merchants blessed their scales and counted their coins with whispered prayers. Nothing was ordinary after the festival. A cracked bowl might now be seen as a sign. A bird singing at an unusual hour might carry a message. People had touched the edge of the divine, and it changed how they saw everything. That was the purpose of the celebration, not to entertain, but to awaken. In this way, the spring festivals, the flower battles, and the rituals of drunkenness and sacrifice did not end with the calendar. They lived on in the gestures of daily life. Every action had weight, every choice echoed, and though the drums had gone silent, the gods were still watching, not just from the temples, but from within the hearts of the people. The festival was over, but its meaning had only just begun. As the seasons shifted and the rains began to drift across the valley, the city prepared for a different kind of celebration. The colors of spring faded into darker tones. Marigolds were replaced by smoke. The drums, once used for summoning warriors, now beat a slower rhythm, one that echoed through alleyways and temple corridors like a heartbeat beneath the earth. It was time to dance with death. In this part of the year, people believed the world grew thinner. The boundary between the living and the dead wasn't gone, but it shimmered delicate, like a curtain in the wind. To honor this fragile passage, entire neighborhoods transformed. Doorways were painted black. Families gathered obsidian mirrors and bone ornaments. Altars were built, not to celebrate victory, but to invite memory. These weren't funerals. They were invitations. People weren't mourning. They were remembering. Every plaza hosted a new kind of dancer. Gone were the flower crowns and feathered robes. These dancers wore masks with hollow eyes, carved from wood or dried gourd. They represented things no one wanted to speak aloud. Sickness, grief, time. But here they were given faces and names. Some masks showed coyotes, others owls, animals believed to travel between worlds. A few were just skulls. The movements of the dancers weren't graceful. They staggered. They spun wildly. Their steps mimicked illness, confusion, even the way the dying tremble. But it was all deliberate. To mock death was to tame it. To wear it was to disarm it. The music was unsettling. Slow flutes, skin drums, rattles made from claws and teeth. Children were warned not to laugh during the processions. This was sacred play. Sometimes, a dancer would stop and lock eyes with a member of the crowd. It didn't matter who. Farmer, a child, a noble. That look meant, one day this will be you. The message was not cruel. It was truth. Priests led the ceremonies with whispered chants and smoke offerings. They burned resin in clay bowls and circled the altars 3 times, once for each phase of existence: birth, life, and what came after. No sacrifices were made during these nights, at least not in the open. Instead, people offered memories: a lock of hair, a bit of food once loved by the dead, ash from a home fire. These items were placed on the altars and left under the stars. Even inside homes, the tone had shifted. Meals were simpler. Conversations were quieter. Grandparents told stories that had waited all year. One woman described how her father once dreamed of a lost brother the night before this festival. Another shared a tale of a child who had followed a dancer into the woods and never returned. Not in body, at least. These stories were warnings, but also comforts. They reminded everyone that the veil between worlds was thin, but not cruel. In the temples, statues of the gods were veiled. Their faces were hidden behind cloths of gray and blue. It was said the gods turned their eyes away during these nights, to give the dead room to walk freely. The city belonged to memory now, and memory walked without shame. People confessed secrets in whispers, not to be forgiven, but to be remembered. What was remembered could be healed. What was hidden might rot in silence. And still people danced. In circles, in pairs, even alone. Some danced in grief. Others danced in defiance. The children watched from behind their parents, eyes wide and silent. They knew they were seeing something that could not be explained, only passed on. When the last dancer fell to the ground, pretending to die, a cheer would rise. Not for joy, but for relief. Another year had been marked. Another death had been faced. As dawn approached, the drums stopped. The masks were removed, and slowly people returned to their homes. No one spoke loudly. No one ran. Even the animals were still. The festival was over, but its silence lingered like perfume in the streets. In the days that followed, people would smile more carefully, touch more gently, and speak with more meaning. The dead had been among them, and life for a little while had worn its opposite face. In the days after the festival, when the drums had gone silent and the masks were stored away, something curious happened in the city. People began to whisper, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was said that if you looked carefully, you might still see shadows moving where no one stood. A flicker in the corner of your eye, a cold breeze in a closed room. These weren't ghosts in the frightening sense. They were memories, still lingering, invited by ritual, not banished by it. The Aztecs didn't believe in one kind of afterlife. There wasn't simply a heaven or hell. There were many places a soul might go, depending on how you died. A warrior who fell in battle might follow the sun across the sky. A woman who died in childbirth joined the thunder gods. Those who drowned were welcomed by the rain gods. And those who died ordinary deaths, they had their own long journey through shadowy regions, each one more difficult than the last. That journey could take. Children grew up with this understanding. Death wasn't a stranger to be feared. It was a traveler you'd one day walk beside. In stories, death could laugh, make jokes, even dance. There were no graveyards filled with silence. Instead, homes had altars. Markets sold miniature coffins and tiny masks. Death was part of the daily rhythm. And once a year, that rhythm came to a climax during the festival, when people didn't just honor the dead, but tried to understand them. Masks played a central role in this connection. Some were passed down through generations. Their painted surfaces faded by time and smoke. Others were made fresh each year. Each had meaning. A cracked mask might represent a life cut short. One with mismatched eyes could show the unpredictability of fate. Families took great care in selecting or creating the right mask. It was more than decoration. It was a bridge. Music, too, held layers of symbolism. The slow pulse of drums mirrored the heartbeat. Rattles filled with seeds represented fertility. Flutes carved from bone were not just instruments. They were vessels of breath, reminders of life and loss. Some melodies were only played during this time of year. If you heard them in other seasons, people believed it could invite bad luck, or worse, confuse the spirits about where they belonged. Food was another offering, and not just for the living. Tamales, beans, fruit, and cups of ceremonial drink were laid on altars as gifts, not to feed the dead, but to comfort them. Each item had a memory, a grandmother's favorite stew, a brother's preferred sweet. These meals were not eaten. They were stories told in flavor and scent. The smell alone could bring tears to someone who remembered too much. Some people took the ritual further. They spent entire nights in vigil, sleeping beside the altars, listening for dreams. It was said that the dead could speak in sleep, not in words but in impressions. A warm breeze might mean forgiveness. A door that wouldn't open might be a warning. These dreams weren't shared lightly. They were carried like sacred messages, repeated only in hushed tones to those who understood. Even the architecture of the city reflected this balance. Temples had chambers below the ground, meant to echo the underworld. Staircases were built with odd numbers of steps, a symbolic nod to the uneven path between life and death. Murals depicted not only gods, but skeletons dancing, feasting, playing music. Death wasn't hidden. It was embraced, given space, and honored. What's most striking about this entire worldview is its warmth. To modern eyes, skull masks and shadow dances might seem morbid, but to the Aztecs, these were acts of love. To honor the dead was to recognize life's full shape. The laughter, the tears, the silence between, it all mattered. Every chant, every candle, every careful mask stroke was a reminder. Death is not the opposite of life. It's part of it. So when people gathered in the plazas and temples, lighting their fires and placing their offerings, they weren't afraid. They were connected, not to a memory, but to a presence, to family, to ancestors, to the idea that what has passed is never fully gone, as long as someone remembers. And in that remembering, they danced. As twilight fell again over the stone streets of Tenochtitlan, a second night of ritual began. This one was quieter than the first, less theatrical but no less profound. It was the night when families stayed close to home, and the city's heartbeat slowed. In every district, homes glowed with the gentle light of oil lamps, their flickering flames reflecting in bowls of water placed on altars. The dead had been welcomed. Now they were being heard. Storytelling was at the center of the night. Not public performance, but private memory. Elders took their place by the fire, and the younger ones gathered around, not to be entertained, but to listen. Stories of loss and love, of wisdom and mistakes, passed from mouth to ear like heirlooms. A mother might speak of her sister who died during childbirth, describing how brave she had been. A grandfather might recall a childhood friend lost in a flood, whose laughter still rang in his dreams. These stories weren't jay. Alongside the spoken word came the rituals of gesture. Some families tied strands of hair with thread and laid them beside candles, a sign of continuity between generations. Others passed around carved stones or small clay figures representing ancestors. These items had little material value, but their emotional weight was immense. One figure might have belonged to someone's great-grandmother. Another may have been sculpted by a father for his daughter before going off to war. Holding them was like ho! Children were encouraged to participate, not shielded. They were taught how to light a candle, how to place a flower without disturbing the others, how to speak the name of the dead aloud with confidence and care. If a child cried, no one hushed them. Tears were not seen as weakness, but as offerings. To cry was to honor. To remember with feeling was a virtue, not a failure. Outside, the city was unusually still. Even the animals seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Dogs rested quietly near doorways, their ears perked but calm. Birds remained in their nests. The air felt thick, not with fear, but with presence. It was as if the world itself had stepped aside to make room. This was not silence from absence. It was silence from attention, a kind of listening shared by all. Priests did not lead this night's rituals. Instead, it was the people themselves who carried the sacred forward. The rituals had shifted from the temples to the homes, from formal chants to whispered names. It was a redistribution of spiritual responsibility, a reminder that everyone, not just the religious elite, had a part to play in keeping memory alive. And in the Aztec view, memory was everything. It wasn't just about the past. It was nourishment for the present, a thread tying every breath to a wa. Food was still part of the ritual, but this time it was shared. Families sat together and ate in near silence, choosing dishes that had meaning. A bitter herb to remember pain, a sweet fruit to recall joy, a bowl of maize gruel, simple and sustaining, to represent endurance. No one overate. There was no laughter, but no sorrow either. Just presence, just meaning. Toward the end of the night, many families extinguished their candles one by one, speaking a name with each flame. This wasn't an ending. It was ascending, a way to let the spirits return with dignity. Some stayed awake until dawn, watching the horizon. Others went to sleep knowing their presence had been acknowledged. Either way, the ritual was complete. By the fourth day of the death festival, something surprising happened. Laughter returned. Not the loud, careless kind, but a softer, knowing kind, like a chuckle shared between old friends. After days of candles and silence, the people of Tenochtitlan began to smile again. Not because the sadness had passed, but because they had touched something deeper. The dead had been honored. The living had listened. Now came the part where both worlds could enjoy each other. Children were the first to shift the mood. After days of behaving solemnly, they started asking playful questions. Did great-grandfather still like beans? Would our dog in the afterlife chase spirit rabbits? Parents answered seriously, but with a wink. They knew that laughter, too, was sacred. Not everything about death had to be grim. In fact, the festival had always left room for mischief. Across the markets, vendors began selling humorous figurines. Little skeletons playing flutes, cooking tamales, or dancing on one leg. Some were dressed like nobles. Others were made to look like merchants or even lazy husbands. These tiny sculptures were carved from wood or molded from clay, painted with joyful colors and cheeky expressions. They were a hit, especially with children. But they weren't just toys, they were messages. A gentle way of saying, "Look, even death can laugh." One of the more popular rituals involved puppet shows. Families would gather in courtyards as puppeteers acted out stories where skeletons got into trouble. Maybe a bony thief tried to steal from the afterlife's granary and got caught by a ghostly guard dog. Or two skeletons argued over who got the last tortilla, only to realize it had turned to dust. The audience laughed, not at death, but with it. These tales reminded everyone that the dead were still part of the community. Still funny, still foolish, still famil. Food took on a new meaning during these lighter days. Pastries shaped like bones, sweet rolls with tiny skulls pressed into the top, and candies molded into coffins appeared on every table. These weren't meant to frighten. They were treats for both the eye and the spirit. Sharing them was a way to say, "We haven't forgotten you, and we still enjoy the things you loved." Even the ceremonial drink returned in small amounts, sipped respectfully, but this time accompanied by smiles and toasts. Some neighborhoods organized mock parades. People would dress in skeleton costumes, white paint on their faces, bones drawn on their clothes. They danced through the streets with rattles and bells, teasing the onlookers and pretending to stumble or faint dramatically. These performances were more than comedy. They were a reminder that everyone, no matter how powerful or proud, would one day join the dance. And so, best to dance now while the feet still worked. Elders watched all this with quiet approval. They had seen many seasons, many festivals. They knew the importance of balance. First the tears, then the laughter. First the silence, then the song. This was the Aztec way to honor every part of life, including its end, and to do so with beauty and joy. As evening fell, the laughter softened again. Not gone, just settled. People lit candles once more, not for mourning, but for gratitude. They spoke the names of their dead, not with sorrow, but with warmth. "Thank you," they whispered. "We remember. We carry you with us." The flames flickered, and the air felt lighter, as if the spirits smiled back. In the end, the playful side of the death festival did not undo the solemn parts. Completed them. It made them whole. Death had been wept for, feared, respected, and now embraced, not as a monster in the dark, but as a quiet guest who sometimes liked to dance. And in that final, joyful spin, the people of Tenochtitlan found something precious. Peace, not just with death, but with life itself. As the days of remembrance continued, the city's energy shifted again. What had started as solemnity and moved into joy now found its way toward curiosity. People began to wonder, not just about those who had passed, but about death itself. What did it mean to cross over? What might the other side look like? Could the dead see the living? And if they could, did they approve of what they saw? These questions weren't asked in fear, but with the kind of wonder usually reserved for stars or deep caves. Death, to the Aztecs, wasn't a wall. It was a landscape, vast, layered, and full of mystery. It had rivers and mountains, trees that whispered, winds that judged. Elders described it like a journey through shadows and tests, each step requiring something. A memory, a confession, a laugh. Some said the soul had to pass through 9 levels before it could rest. Each level peeled away a layer of W. Children listened wide-eyed to these tales. They asked what the levels were called, but the names didn't matter as much as the meaning. One level was filled with obsidian winds that could cut lies from your spirit. Another was a place of darkness so thick it made you remember who you truly were. Each story was a riddle wrapped in poetry, and each elder told it differently. But the message was always clear. You didn't enter the afterlife by being rich or strong. You earned your way through honesty, love. To help visualize this journey, artists created scrolls filled with images, long paper maps showing a soul's progress through the realms. One section might show skeletons crossing a river on the backs of butterflies. Another depicted giant toads guarding narrow paths. Children copied these images, adding their own twists. Maybe a smiling sun peeking out behind the bones, or a helpful turtle showing the way. Death was being drawn, talked about, shared. In the markets, merchants leaned into this theme. They sold small games that mirrored the afterlife journey. A wooden board with pegs represented levels of challenge. Dice rolls determined if your soul moved forward or stayed behind. Families played together in the evenings, cheering when a spirit made it past the 5th level, groaning when it landed on wind of forgetting. Even in play, people learned. They laughed and thought. Music reflected this spirit of playful exploration. New songs emerged, half lullaby, half riddle. One popular tune began, "If I meet a skeleton, I'll ask for their name. If they answer kindly, I'll do the same." These songs were sung quietly as people prepared food, cleaned their homes, or stitched clothes. They weren't festival anthems. They were background comfort, little melodies that said, "You are not alone. Even in death, you're not alone." Some families created mock passports for the dead, folded bits of paper where they wrote what the person had loved most in life. She loved birds and sweet bread. He played the flute and told jokes about turtles. These papers were placed on altars alongside food and candles. They weren't official documents, of course, but they were deeply personal, and somehow they made the spirits feel more real. Not distant ancestors, but people with tastes, flaws, and stories. Throughout this period, the idea of death stopped feeling final. Instead, it felt like a doorway, strange, yes, but not hostile. Something to approach slowly, with reverence and perhaps even a little curiosity. In this way, the death festival had come full circle. It had moved through grief, memory, laughter, and now, understanding. By evening, as the sun dipped low behind the temples, people gathered once again. Not for ceremony, but simply to sit. Neighbors talked. Strangers shared food. Children showed off drawings of dancing skeletons. No one tried to rush the moment. No one needed to. It was enough just to be there, together under the same sky that one day all would return to. And in that quiet, playful acceptance, the city of the living met the world of the dead. Not in fear, but in friendship. There was no official end to the death festival. No trumpet call or final chant. It simply faded, like smoke from a fire, drifting into daily life until no one could say when it had truly passed. And yet, something lingered. The city had changed. People moved through the streets with a quiet awareness, as if the veil between worlds had not fully closed, only shifted to the side. What remained were the habits. A candle left burning longer than usual. A name whispered while folding laundry. A skeleton charm tied discreetly to a child's tunic. These small things were no longer part of a festival. They had become part of life. The line between ritual and routine had blurred, and no one minded. If anything, they welcomed it. In workshops, artisans found themselves carving more skulls into their work. Not gruesome ones, but thoughtful ones. A skull smiling beneath a bird, or holding a flower between its teeth. Potters added bones to the handles of mugs. Weavers stitched patterns of life and death into their cloth. Not because someone told them to, but because it felt honest. They had seen how close life and death truly were, not as enemies, but as neighbors. Even the marketplace bore the mark of remembrance. Among the rows of maize and squash, you might find a vendor selling candles in pairs. One for the living, one for the lost. Some people began to carry small tokens, smooth stones etched with names or symbols, in their pockets. A quiet comfort, a way to remember without always speaking aloud. Children, especially, carried the spirit of the festival forward. They still played skeleton games, still sang the strange songs about talking skulls and helpful ghosts. Some even drew pictures of themselves with bone faces, not as monsters but as adventurers. To them, death was no longer a frightening unknown. It was part of the story, part of their growing up tales, like the moon or the rain. The priests observed all this with interest. The rituals had ended, but something deeper had begun. Devotion no longer needed incense or chanting. It was in how someone greeted a neighbor, how they offered food to a beggar, how they helped an elder carry firewood. These gestures were simple but sacred. The gods, it was said, could see the heart in every act. In time, the altars were cleared, the last marigolds swept away, but the lessons remained. People spoke a little more kindly. They paused before anger. They forgave a bit more freely. These were not commandments from temples. They were instincts from the soul, shaped by nights of candlelight, by stories whispered in the dark, by dances shared with shadows. And so, without noticing it, the city wove death into its rhythm, not in fear but in familiarity. Every laugh carried a memory. Every step honored someone no longer there. The people of Tenochtitlan did not believe death was an end. They believed it was a presence, not always seen but always near. And if you treated it well, with song, with story, with a playful mask, it might just treat you kindly in return. In the end, the most powerful lesson was this: life is not diminished by death's shadow. It is made brighter. The memory of the lost does not darken the day. It deepens it. And when people remembered, when they laughed and cried and offered a piece of bread to a spirit, they weren't escaping grief. They were dancing with it, gracefully, together. And somewhere, if the old stories are to be believed, the spirits dance too. In schools and family gatherings, the memory of the festival became its own kind of teaching. Parents used the rituals not to frighten, but to guide. Respect your ancestors, they'd say, because one day, someone will remember you. Teachers reminded their pupils that history was not just dates and rulers, but songs and silences, gestures and jokes passed down like treasures. It wasn't about perfection. It was about participation, showing up, lighting the candle, telling the story, sharing the bread. Even travelers who returned to the city after weeks away could feel it. Something had softened in the air, something that made greetings warmer, meals longer, tempers slower to rise. That was the true magic of the Death Festival. Not the masks or the drums, but the change it left behind. A kind of glow, not visible to the eye, but unmistakable to the heart. In the heart of the valley, under the wide sky and among the humming fields, life was not all ceremony and song. It was work, endless, rhythmic, and often harsh. For most people in the empire, the sun was not a god to be worshipped with poetry. It was a clock, a signal to rise, to sweat, to endure. The real stories weren't written in temples. They unfolded in the corn rows, the canals, and the quiet strength of calloused hands. From the youngest age, children learned the rhythm of labor. A boy might begin by chasing birds from the fields. A girl might carry water, her feet learning the shape of the path long before she understood why. It wasn't just about survival. It was about participation. Everyone had a role. Everyone mattered. And through repetition, work became a kind of music. The scrape of stone against wood, the slap of laundry on flat rocks, the rustle of stalks in the breeze. The fields themselves were a marvel of design. Raised garden beds known as chinampas floated on the shallow lakes, held together by mud, reeds, and roots. They looked delicate from a distance, like green rafts, but step onto one and you'd feel the firmness beneath your feet, a testament to generations of careful construction. Each chinampa was tended daily, weeding, planting, harvesting, and reinforcing the edges with woven mats. There were no shortcuts. Nature was generous, but only to the diligent. Farmers worked with more than just tools, they worked with timing. Knowing when to plant wasn't a guess. It was a science built on observation. The position of stars, the pattern of clouds, the feel of the wind. An early rain could mean bounty or disaster, depending on how it was read. A missed planting window could undo a season. No one waited to be told. Knowledge was passed by watching, by doing, by remembering what the land had said last year and the year before. But the work didn't end in the fields. It continued in the kitchens, the workshops, the markets. Women ground maize each morning. the rhythmic sound of stone on stone echoing before sunrise. Potters shaped bowls that would carry offerings and dinner alike. Fishermen checked their lines with silent care. And through it all, danger lurked, not from enemies, but from nature itself. A misstep in a canal could mean drowning. A scorpion in the firewood could end a life. The dangers weren't loud. They were patient. Even celebrations were tied to labor. Before a feast, there was preparation. Days of grinding, stirring, wrapping, and baking. Wood had to be gathered, stones heated, animals cleaned and seasoned. The party only sparkled because someone had broken their back to make it happen. And those who did the work didn't complain, not because they liked the strain, but because they knew it meant something. Food tasted different when your own hands had helped make it. Tools were passed down like names. A worn hoe handle might carry the thumbprint of a grandfather. A cooking stone might have seen 4 generations of stew. People cared for these items not because they were rare, but because they were familiar. If something broke, it wasn't discarded. It was repaired, blessed, reused. There was a quiet pride in this, not flashy, but strong. A sense that work, when done well, carried its own dignity. Rest existed, but not often. And when it came, it was earned. A stolen moment in the shade, a cup of cool water, a shared joke with a neighbor. These were luxuries. And because they were rare, they were savored. The people didn't need opulence to feel joy. They found it in the certainty of a day well spent, a task completed, a small success shared. This was the other face of the empire, not golden temples, but muddy feet. Not plumed warriors, but mothers with baskets, children with chores, elders with aching knees and watchful eyes. The power of the city was built not just on conquest, but on cooperation. And at the center of it all was work, steady, sacred, and unending. Among all the tasks that filled a person's life, there was one constant. The land did not wait. It asked for attention every hour, in every season, under every kind of sky. If a storm rolled across the lake, farmers didn't hide. They anchored their canoes, tightened the edges of the chinampas, and worked through the downpour. The wind might slap the water into their faces, but they moved forward, feet steady on floating earth, hands busy with bundles of reeds or seed baskets. This wasn't bravery in the storybook sense. No one saw themselves as heroes. It was simply what had to be done. And yet, within that stubborn rhythm, there was something noble. The work shaped the people. Shoulders became thick from years of lifting. Eyes grew sharp from scanning the sky for signs. Even laughter came differently, low, short, shared only when it wouldn't interrupt a task. To live well wasn't to rest often. It was to move with purpose. In the mountains beyond the valley, others carved terraces into steep slopes, creating patches of earth that clung like shelves to the rock. The soil here was thinner, the rain less kind, but still they grew. People hauled baskets of compost on their backs, climbing narrow paths with steps worn smooth by generations. They sang as they worked, not loud songs, but breath-steadying tunes to help the climb. Each note was a promise. The land gives back if you ask properly. Down below, in the workshops of the city, another kind of labor hummed quietly. Stonecutters sat cross-legged with obsidian blades, crafting tools and charms. Feather workers arranged plumes in delicate patterns for cloaks and fans. Each motion was precise, practiced, almost meditative. A single mistake, the wrong cut, the dropped feather, could ruin hours of effort. But no one rushed. In a world where materials were precious, patience was a kind of wealth. Even the children's games mirrored this world of effort. They played with spinning tops made from gourds, or tossed stones in rhythm games that trained their hands and focus. A favorite challenge involved carrying water in a clay bowl without spilling a drop. It looked like fun, but it taught balance and care. Everything had purpose, even play, and through these little lessons, they were slowly invited into the world of grown-up responsibility. Danger, too, had its lessons. In the hills, snakes coiled beneath warm rocks. In the water, fishhooks could snap back and cut deep. Even the sun itself could burn if you stayed too long. These weren't reasons to avoid work, just reminders to move wisely. People learned to read their surroundings like a second language. A change in birdsong, a shift in wind, a strange scent in the air, all signals, all warnings. The land didn't speak with words, but it was always talking. What held everything together was cooperation. A canal blocked by debris, neighbors cleared it together. A family short on firewood, someone shared their pile. Not because it was expected, but because it was understood. Life was hard, harder alone. And so, people leaned on each other, quietly, steadily, without ceremony. Helping wasn't heroic. It was just part of the weave. In the evenings, as the fires burned low and tools were put away, people sat on mats and shared what the day had brought. Not in grand tales, but in simple phrases. The squash are late. The clay cracked again. The wind is turning. These weren't complaints. They were observations, offered up like stones laid into a wall. Each one added to the structure of shared life, a kind of quiet architecture built from listening. There were no medals for endurance, no holidays for hard work. But there was pride. Not the loud kind, the kind that came from knowing you'd done your part, that you'd helped keep the water flowing, the maize growing, the fires lit. In that, there was honor, even if no one ever said the word out loud. And so, the days, or rather, the flow of time, carried on. The work changed shape with the weather, with the needs of the season, but it never stopped. It wove through every breath and gesture, from the splash of a paddle to the hiss of wood on fire. And within that weaving, life found its shape, solid, steady, and deeply alive. Amid the steady hum of daily labor, there were places where work took on a different kind of tension, not from exhaustion, but from risk. The edge of the forest, the tops of hills, the farthest canals. These were the margins of the world, where people worked not just with effort, but with alertness. You could build a life in the valley, but sometimes you had to step outside it. And out there, the rules changed. Hunters knew this better than anyone. They walked silently among the trees, eyes scanning for movement, ears tuned for the snap of a twig or the rustle of feathers. Each trip required skill, not just in using the otlotl or setting a trap, but in reading the forest itself. Tracks told stories. Broken branches gave warnings. The smell of crushed leaves underfoot could tell you if deer had passed recently, or if something more dangerous had. Jaguars, though rarely seen, were never forgotten. Gatherers faced their own kinds of danger. They climbed hills to find rare herbs, ventured into tangled underbrush to collect wood, or waded into shallows where reeds grew thick. A slip of the foot, a wrong grip on a thorny branch, a misstep into a hidden hole. These could all change a task into an emergency. And yet they kept going. Not from recklessness, but from understanding. The land gave, but it also tested. Respect wasn't optional. It was essential. Travel was another form of risk. Traders, carrying salt or cacao or woven cloth, followed routes that wound through mountains, across lakes, and along dusty causeways. Their loads were heavy, and their eyes always alert, not just for bandits or wild animals, but for signs that the trail itself had shifted. A washed-out bridge, a sinkhole, fallen tree. The road had its moods, and only those who listened carefully made it through. But danger didn't always wear claws or fangs. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in spoiled food, in a fever that wouldn't break, in a sudden injury that stopped a strong worker cold. Without modern tools, even small problems could grow large. A splinter that festered, a burn that refused to heal. Families learned to read these signs and respond quickly. Leaves became poultices. Steam became medicine. Songs were sung not just for comfort, but for healing, rhythm as remedy. Among the workers, there was no shame in being cautious. In fact, caution was seen as a kind of wisdom. Children were praised not just for strength, but for attentiveness. "Look before you step," a grandmother might say. "The land is listening." And it was. It always was. A safe journey wasn't luck. It was earned through preparation and care. There were rituals, too, for moments of risk. A handful of soil tossed into the wind before a hunt. A quiet breath blown into the water before stepping into a canoe. These were not grand ceremonies, but private acts of connection. They said, "I see you, world. I know you're watching. Let me pass safely, and I will walk with care." Even in the city, danger had its places. Construction workers hauled stones up steep ramps, balancing weight and rhythm. Roof thatchers perched on beams high above the ground. A single misstep could be fatal, but they moved with confidence born from habit, knowing where to grip, how to shift their weight, when to pause and let the wind settle. Danger didn't paralyze them, it sharpened them. And yet, for all the risk, there was rarely fear. Fear was useful in moments, but useless as a lifestyle. People lived with danger the way they lived with rain or hunger, not denying it, but learning to walk beside it. They built lives that were strong not because nothing went wrong, but because they knew how to respond when it did. That was the quiet strength of the empire. It wasn't just in the temples or the palaces. It was in the way a fisherman tied his knots, the way a mother checked a pot for cracks, the way a traveler felt the wind before crossing a ridge. These small, constant acts of care, they were the true walls of the city, and they held strong not because of what they kept out, but because of what they held together. Not all dangers came from the wild or the work itself. Sometimes, the hardest struggles were hidden beneath the surface, in the weight of expectations, in the strain of responsibility, in the quiet toll of doing the same tasks day after day. These pressures didn't leave bruises or scars, but they marked people all the same. Take the young ones, for example. Growing up meant learning fast, working hard, and carrying more than your size suggested. There was pride in that, a sense of belonging. But it also meant little room for softness. A child who fell behind was gently corrected, but rarely excused. "Try again," they'd hear. "You're strong enough." And often they were. Still, even strength needs rest. And sometimes the young learned to hide their tiredness instead of speaking it. Among adults, the pressure was different. It came from knowing how many others depended on you. If your hands didn't plant, there was no food. If your back didn't carry, someone else would have to. So people kept going, even when their muscles ached and their minds drifted. Rest was respected in theory, but in practice it was rare. You rested when the job allowed it, not when the body asked. Mothers, especially, carried double burdens. Their work stretched from field to fire, from cradle to grindstone. They knew how to make a stew from almost nothing, how to braid hair while watching maize boil, how to keep toddlers safe near open flames. Their knowledge was deep, their pace relentless. And though they rarely spoke of exhaustion, it showed in the way they leaned on the doorframe at dusk, in the long pauses before answering a simple question. But there were moments, brief, stolen, when the rhythm slowed. A worker might stop mid-task to watch a hawk circle high above. A mother might hum a tune just for herself while kneading dough. A grandfather might pretend to check his fishing line just so he could sit a moment longer on a flat stone warmed by the sun. These weren't acts of laziness. They were acts of survival. Tiny rebellions against the pressure to be useful every second of the day. And there was laughter, not loud or constant, but present, like a stream under snow. A joke whispered during firewood chopping. A silly face made behind a pottery jar. Even in the hardest times, people found ways to smile. It wasn't foolishness. It was fuel. Because in a world that asked so much, joy wasn't a luxury. It was a tool as necessary as a knife or a basket. Stories helped too. People told tales while weaving mats or patching roofs. Stories of clever foxes, of foolish gods, of brave children who tricked giants. These weren't just entertainment. They were reminders. Strength can come in many forms. Wit matters as much as muscle. And everyone, even the tired or the small, has something to offer. In these tales, no one was too poor to matter. No one too tired to try. Even silence had its place. After a long day, families might sit together and say nothing at all. Just being in the same space was enough. The fire would crackle. A breeze might stir the thatch. Someone might sip a bowl of gruel slowly, eyes half closed. These silences weren't empty. They were full of gratitude, of shared weariness, of quiet love. What made it all bearable, the weight, the repetition, the risks and responsibilities, was that no one carried it alone. Life in the city, in the fields, in the hills and markets, was woven like cloth. Tight, overlapping, strong. You pulled your thread and someone else pulled theirs. And somehow it held. So while the dangers were real, not just outside, but within, they were met with something greater. A shared will to keep going. To build, to raise, to repair. To bring in the harvest, to teach the child, to patch the wall. Not because anyone promised ease, but because the work, in all its strain and silence, held meaning. And in that meaning, people found endurance. Some of the hardest work took place where few others could see it. Deep in the kitchens, behind the clay ovens, and in the quiet corners of weaving rooms or tool sheds, people shaped the daily life of the city in silence. Their efforts didn't draw crowds or applause, but without them, nothing else would function. These were the keepers of rhythm, the ones who made sure the pulse of home, of community, kept beating. Take the cooks, for example. Long before most people stirred, the fire had already been coaxed to life. Ashes from the night before were carefully cleared. A spark caught in dry grass. Slowly, the flame grew. Maize was soaked, ground, kneaded. Tortillas were pressed by hand and laid on hot stones, each one puffing gently like a sigh. Nothing was rushed, but everything was timed. If breakfast was late, the whole day shifted. So it was not just cooking, it was choreography. Weavers were much the same. Sitting cross-legged, their bodies became part of the loom. Hands moved without hesitation. Over, under, tighten, shift. Colors blended with purpose. A red stripe for blood, a blue thread for the sky. Patterns weren't random. They told stories. Of families, of fields, of forgotten winds. Each finished cloth was both garment and memory, something worn not just on the body, but in the heart. Toolmakers, too, carried a quiet importance. A poorly shaped blade could ruin a harvest. A weak handle could break during a critical strike. So the workers carved slowly, testing balance, checking grain, smoothing edges with care. They didn't see their tools as objects. They saw them as promises, to the hands that would hold them, to the tasks that waited ahead. And then there were the fixers, those who could repair a cracked jar, rebind a fraying basket, patch a wall that was beginning to lean. Their work wasn't flashy, but it kept the world from falling apart. A well-placed stitch or a properly tied cord might mean the difference between a calm evening and a collapsed roof. These people worked with patience, not panic. And in doing so, they taught a quiet lesson. Not everything broken needs replacing. Some things just need care. Even in the act of cleaning, there was purpose. Sweeping the floors of a home or the plaza wasn't just about removing dust. It was about resetting the day. Children learned to sweep not as punishment, but as practice for noticing details, for respecting space, for beginning again. A clean mat was an invitation, a brushed threshold, a small blessing. Music sometimes came from these hidden corners. A hum while grinding maize, a low whistle while threading reeds. Not performance, but presence, a reminder that even in repetition, there could be beauty. That a task didn't need to be loud to be meaningful. That the smallest rituals could hold the most grace. There was also invention, not dramatic breakthroughs, but tiny adjustments. A better way to store water. A smarter fold in a market basket. A loop added to a carrying cloth to ease pressure on the shoulders. These ideas didn't come from scholars. They came from the people closest to the work, the ones who felt the pinch, the heat, the weight. Change grew from need, and it spread like light. What bound all of this together was care. Not grand affection, but consistent attention. A sense that every corner mattered, every gesture had weight. People didn't need to be watched to do things well. They watched themselves. Because the home, the family, the street, they weren't separate. They were reflections of the same effort, the same care. And so, while the city's power might be counted in warriors or priests or temples, its heartbeat was kept by those in the background. By the hands that mended, stirred, wove, and swept. Their names might not fill stone carvings, but their touch was everywhere. In the warmth of a meal, the strength of a roof, the softness of a shirt. And that was legacy enough. By the time a person reached old age, they had done the work of many lifetimes. Not because they had lived longer than others, but because they had touched so many parts of the world. Their hands had shaped clay, carried wood, soothed children, planted seeds, woven mats, and steadied shoulders. Each wrinkle told a story, not of years, but of effort, of purpose, of care given over and over again. Elders weren't treated as relics of the past. They were living libraries. People came to them not just for memories, but for methods. How do you seal a leaky basket? How do you calm a restless child? How do you know when the rains are close? Their answers were rarely direct. A shrug, parable, a joke told half seriously. But behind every word was a map, a thread back through time. And yet, age didn't mean rest. Many elders still worked, in slower rhythms perhaps, but with deep precision. They taught by doing. A grandmother might show how to twist a cord so it wouldn't unravel. A grandfather might demonstrate how to press the stones just right to start a fire in the wind. These gestures were small, but they were golden. Not written down, just passed on like bread from hand to hand. Wisdom didn't come from books. It came from surviving, from seeing floods and droughts, laughter and grief, success, and collapse. From knowing that sometimes the hardest work was simply showing up, again and again, even when the back ached and the tools felt heavy. This kind of knowing couldn't be faked. It showed in the way someone held silence, or how they looked at a cracked pot and knew exactly how to fix it, or if it could be fixed at all. Communities made space for this kind of quiet leadership, not with titles or ceremonies, but with trust. If an elder spoke, people listened. If they fell silent, people waited. They didn't demand to be heard, they simply were, because people knew. Someone who had lived through enough storms knew when the wind was changing, even if the sky still looked calm. This long view, this patience, shaped more than just practical life. It shaped how people handled hardship. Poor harvest didn't bring panic. A broken roof didn't cause despair. There was always someone who remembered, "We've been through worse. Here's what we did." These weren't just comforting words. They were action plans rooted in memory, in muscle, in resilience. And perhaps the greatest gift elders gave wasn't knowledge, but perspective. They reminded people that no task was beneath them, and no effort was wasted. That a life spent weaving mats or tending fires could be just as grand, maybe grander, than one spent in temples or courts. Because in the end, what mattered most was not how high you climbed, but how well you carried what was given to you. In quiet moments, elders often sat near the fire, eyes half closed, listening. Not asleep, just remembering. Faces, songs, smells, voices, all still vivid in their minds. If you sat beside them long enough, they might begin to share. Or they might not. Sometimes the greatest wisdom wasn't a story told, but a story felt, a presence, a pause, a breath shared between generations. That's how the city endured, not just through stone and ceremony, but through memory and motion, through work done with care, through hands that remembered and hands that learned. It was a place built not just on labor, but on legacy. And the thread that bound it all together wasn't gold or power. It was people, steady, strong, and full of grace. So when you imagine this world, the empire, the city, the people who moved through it, don't just think of warriors and priests. Think of the old man mending a fishing net for the 100th time. The woman showing her granddaughter how to twist thread into rope. Think of the laughter over a meal, the hush of a shared silence, the rhythm of footsteps on worn stone. That is where the heart of the story lives. In the labor, in the lessons, in the love.